Hi, everyone. It's Don Davis here, your host of Supply Chain Secrets, introducing the episode. So, in today's episode, we talked to James Thatcher. He's the import-export manager for Totes Isotoner. He's also a fellow podcaster. I feel like I've had a few fellow podcasters on recently. And he also has a background at Hellman. He spent quite a few years there and has some interesting perspective. And on today's show, James gives an introduction of how he landed where he is today and his journey to Totes Isotoner. And then we talked a little bit about what's changed from the pandemic. What has he seen from his perspective? And then we got into a conversation on IPI points and moving containers. And James had a lot of thoughts about some of the pains and struggles that he's been going through as a shipper there. And then we started to talk a little bit about ocean carriers and how do ocean carriers differentiate themselves and what kinds of things are they doing today that create value? What does he look for in his procurement process? And then we started to double down a little bit more and talk on technology specifically, because that was one of his differentiator points. And then we started to talk about the future outlook and what types of things would create value, what kinds of things need to change in the industry. And then finally, everyone's favorite part, they get to play podcast, or they get to turn the tables on me and ask me some tough questions. And James asked me a pretty tough question this episode, but I think I did okay answering it. But great show. I think you'll like it. So give it a listen. And thanks for listening.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Don Davis.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of NVO Experience over here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM. And welcome to another episode of Supply Chain Secrets. On today's show, we have a very exciting guest. We have James Thatcher. He is the Import-Export Manager for Totes Isotoner. He's also a fellow podcaster, so interested to hear his experiences there. And he also has a background in the industry, was at Hellman for quite some time. And James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Don. I appreciate it.
Well, so why don't we start there and tell our guests a little bit about yourself, your background, and the journey of how you got to where you are today.
Well, it all started about 43 years ago. Wow, I'm aging myself already. That's awesome. So I came into this industry partly by design and partly by accident. When I was in college, proud rocket from the University of Toledo, I thought I was going to go to law school, become a lawyer and work in corporate law and specifically admiralty law, which was really of interest to me because my grandfather and my uncle are pilots, professional pilots, and my great-grandfather was a sailor. So we have sailors and pilots in my family already, and I thought, I'll go into admiralty law, keep within the family tradition. And then I did not do so well on the LSAT, and I had a vice president at the University of Toledo who I was very active with and involved with, and knew that I had potential for some reason, offered me a graduate assistantship to stick around and get my MBA, and so I took him up on that offer. And so I ended up with an MBA in operations management focusing on international supply chain. I thought I was going to go on to the evil side of it, which is the purchasing realm, never knowing I was going to end up over on the transportation side. Then 9/11 happened and nobody was hiring. So I became a substitute school teacher for about a year in Monroe County, Michigan. And that actually prepared me quite a bit for dealing with some people in our industry. And from there, I was picked up by Hellman Worldwide Logistics in 2003 as an import analyst, then coordinator, then manager, then on-site operations manager, then customs compliance area manager, then U.S. customs compliance and information manager. And then from that, I moved over to Totes Isotoner. So I've had experience with almost every type of industry, from aerospace to automotive to agriculture to fashion and design to pharmaceuticals to furniture. And it's been a very crazy, wild ride. I've done everything from imports, exports, air, ocean, customs compliance. I've dipped my toe a little bit in warehousing, tried to stay away from that as much as possible because no offense to the warehousing people out there, y'all are crazy. But, I've done a little bit of everything. And I think that's part of the reason why Totes brought me on, was because they were getting somebody who had this wide breadth of knowledge. And quite honestly, they didn't want to keep bringing in different consultants to pay to do certain things. They wanted somebody to come in and basically centralize it down. And so that was where I came into play with Totes.
Well, and I think that makes a lot of sense because if you look at today's industry, it's been so challenging in the market that it makes sense. You want people with a wealth of knowledge and a variety of backgrounds because, the standard solutions you might have had 10 years ago aren't really going to work today because things have changed so much. And maybe we could start there.
I would argue the standard solutions from 5 years ago don't work today anymore.
Well, that's true. And a lot of people point to the pandemic that really changed things. And I think my perspective is that, things were on their way to changing, but the pandemic certainly accelerated a lot of those changes. But can you talk a little bit about when things first shut down up until now? How have things changed and what's top of mind for you when you reflect back to when the pandemic started up until now?
Yeah, so I want to warn you and the listeners ahead of time. I use a lot of metaphors, so just be prepared. Our supply chain was basically, in my mind, held together by chewing gum and baling wire for a long time. Let's be honest. In the United States, our rail infrastructure is controlled under a duopoly where you have two primary rail providers on the East Coast and two primary providers on the West Coast, and never the twain shall meet unless it's in Chicago. And it feels like that pressure has been strongly building from an internal perspective forever. We've been seeing, I remember when I came into this industry 20 years ago, if you had a container in Seattle, it would be in Chicago. When the day the vessel docked, it would be in Chicago 4, maybe 5 days later, period, end of story. Now, forget COVID. Let's even take the port workers out of the issue for the moment. Just once it's checked in to the rail yard in Seattle, it's still a good 6, 7, maybe even 8 days till it gets to Chicago. And the same used to be said for LA. LA used to be 3, maybe 4 days in Chicago, and now you're lucky if it's there in a week. It is, that part of it has always been kind of rough. I think on the ocean carrier side, we've seen, there's been this M&A mentality, this buildup of this M&A mentality. Don, I know when you started and when I was starting in the industry, you had a top 30 list roughly of carriers that you could choose from. Now you've got a top 8, if even 8. And so in some ways that's a good thing because we have less, I would say, bloat in the industry. Things are becoming more streamlined. But on the flip side of that, because we have less bloat, there's less cream rising to the top. There's less excellence in the industry overall. One guy can do everything the other guy can do. The IT differences are all the same now. The question now becomes, okay, how many containers do you actually have overseas? And which literal piers? Now we're asking not which ports do you come into, which piers do you come into? Because some piers are faster than other piers because of who owns who. So those things add up. And it gets a little more crazy now. I would say if you asked me in 2019, is our supply chain strong? I would laugh. I would have said no. Our supply chain's being barely held together. Then COVID hits, China shuts down for months, and I don't want to say that was the pebble that started the avalanche, because I think there was already pebbles falling, but that might have been the first big rock to start tumbling down on us. And we saw how frail our supply chain really was. And might I say, I don't see it getting any better. It's been 2.5 years. And we still have port congestion that's ridiculous, that's unacceptable. We still have rail congestion that's unacceptable. There are no more truckers, let's be honest. The capability to do the last mile has become not easier, but harder. And, we could make arguments that, well, automation could make it better, or we can make arguments that we need to diversify how we're handling last mile logistics nowadays. And sure, that's true. But what I have told people is when they asked me at the beginning of this year, they said, well, it's going to get better, right? Because everybody's learned their lessons. I said, guys, how many more peers have we added? 0. How many more rail companies have come in line to be able to handle more freight? Zero. How many more truckers do we have than we had last year? Negative amounts, right? It's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. It's going to get tighter. Now, does that mean it's always going to be terrible? No. It just means we're at the phase of the bottleneck that we just have to push through to get to the other side. And we're just not there yet because, quite honestly, I don't think we know yet how to make it better. I don't think we've, the $6 billion question that everybody's, or trillion, I should say, dollar question that everybody's asking is, well, how do you get boats to not have to stack up at the ports? You could say, oh, we just need to automate all the ports. Well, automating all the ports isn't the answer. First of all, forget the ILWU and the ILA. Let's take them out of that part of the equation. Automating ports is not going to be the only answer. Oh, well, we need to massively overhaul the rail lines. Well, yes, but that's only going to do you good once you get it off the boat, okay? But then what are you going to do when Chicago clogs up and you can't get freight through Chicago, right? If you're going from West Coast to East Coast, Chicago is your biggest bottleneck right now. And quite honestly, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how great you've gotten it to Chicago, and this is not a push on anybody negative in Chicago. It's just that's where the bottleneck is. We haven't figured out how to untangle that knot. And then trucking. How do you make more truckers? Do you change legislation? Do you change insurance requirements? I've heard truckers tell me right now that you have to drive with a regular CDL and an 18-wheeler for at least 2 years before an insurance company will let you drive intermodal. And they don't count, the insurance companies do not count prior military service of somebody driving a truck, which to me is ridiculous. So how do we convert these things? How do we make them better? And it's not one solution. It has to be a package.
Yeah, and you covered a lot of stuff there, James. There's at least 3 things I want to dig a little deeper on because I think you talked about, IPI cargo and container moves, and I think we should talk a little bit about that because I think for some shippers, they may not have the perspective because they might just only be carrying it to the port. And I think anyone that's been moving intermodal into Chicago, particularly via Seattle, it's been a tough year to try and do that because containers get buried. But I think there's some other things you brought up too, and that is, carriers are the same, and I'd love to dive into that in a second. If carriers are the same, because it sounds like with only 8 carriers, it might feel very similar across carriers, but I'd like to talk about differentiators in a minute. And then you had a little bit of a forward-looking view about maybe when things are going to get better. But before we get to any of those things, let's just talk about the IPI experience, because I think it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on getting to Chicago. Now, there's a few different ways you can get to Chicago. And if I look at it, I would say, well, you can go in through Canada, you can go in through Seattle, you can go in through LA, maybe you can go in through the East Coast if you can stand the transit time. But you could argue, well, the way things come in from the West Coast, it may be better to go in through the East Coast. But can you talk about a little bit about your experience moving containers inland? Have there been any solutions that work? Has anything worked? Or do you feel like, we've tried like 5 different things and it's all really the same problem?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm going to break down your breakdown for just a second. The East Coast is a great option if you can find the space, right? I mean, that everybody is trying to get on those East Coast vessels. Let's be honest, right? If you're spooked about the rail, you're spooked about the ports, or you're spooked about the labor negotiation. So lots of people are trying to get on those boats right now. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's very difficult to get space on those boats. East Coast, when they don't have backlogs at their ports, like New York has had, and Savannah has dramatically had over the last couple months, East Coast, I think, is a great option. Now, coming IPI instead of RIPI, coming IPI from the West Coast to the East Coast, what we're seeing is it depends. Seattle's getting better. For those of us that have, Totes, we rail all of our cargo to Cincinnati, Ohio. That's where our base is. We have to go through Chicago because we don't have a choice. Whether we're coming from LA, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma, or either the Canadian West Coast ports, we have to go through Chicago. Seattle is getting better. I will give them credit. They're slowly digging themselves out. Now, are they going to cause another problem because they're doing a certain method to dig themselves out? Maybe. But as of right now, it's slowly getting better. LA seems to be backlogged, just like everybody else. Oakland's kind of feeling the same pressure. We've had pretty good luck through Vancouver, which I know, in the past, I'm not saying anything anti-Jones Act by saying this because I'm not selling the freight, but Vancouver has always been a good God, stay away from there. They never get enough flat cars. They always have passenger train problems just getting out of the city. It's a mess. It's a nightmare. Don't even bother going through Vancouver. Vancouver has actually been doing quite well for us, surprisingly. Prince Rupert's not bad. We've seen some delays in Prince Rupert, but that's the seasonal delays that you always see in Prince Rupert about this time. So, do I think there's one West Coast port that's better than the others? I would say Canada's doing quite well right now. Now, that's as of the time of this recording at this hour, at this very second. 10 seconds from now, something could blow up. And, again, we live on a baling wires, chewing gum kind of environment right now. But getting to Chicago is always, I hate to say the Gordian knot, but it's the Gordian knot. You get into Chicago, once you get to Chicago, and for us, our big problem is we don't terminate in Chicago. We transfer through Chicago. We used to terminate in Chicago. It has become very, very expensive to terminate in Chicago and truck down to Cincinnati anymore. It's too expensive. It's just cheaper for us to rail. I could talk about cost savings, but I'd probably get in trouble with how much I'd tell you I'm saving. But it's a lot of money. The best way that we've seen this is when we, as Totes at least, when we have a huge block of containers, and by huge block, I'm saying well over 20 to 30 containers, we can get that steel to steel transfer. And that is the fast transfer. You don't have to unload it. You don't have to wait on anybody. The flat car goes immediately over to the next yard, and it switches from either UP and BNSF over to CSX or Norfolk Southern, and it's a very seamless process. It takes less time, or it comes into CN Harvey or CP, and it seems to take a lot less time. If you don't have that volume and you get stuck and have to offload and then rubber tire it over to the other yard, you can wait as much as a week, if not more. And that seems to be the big holdup in Chicago as far as for those of us that transfer through Chicago. If you're stopping in Chicago, everybody I've talked to about stopping in Chicago said it's gotten nothing but worse. Containers get lost, containers are missing, truckers are in there for hours trying to find one container. It's almost as bad as it used to be on the West Coast before we had appointment times. I mean, that's kind of how it feels.
Yeah. And, I guess two things. One is it sounds like you need a diversified strategy if you're going to move IPI, because you never know, as you say, like, hey, this is getting better. Hey, today Vancouver is good. But we all know that could change in a week, right? There's just one shock that just completely derails that. No pun intended for using derail, by the way. But it could impact your ability. So it sounds like a diversified strategy is important.
Well, the other thing you can do is transload. And I will be honest, we transloaded last year and we still had problems because the ports were backlogged. Forget the rail portion of it. The ports were so backlogged and dealing with the storage and the fees and not being able to get to containers. And, there's been a lot of action taken now with the ORSCA. I think I said that one right. The Ocean Reform Act.
Yeah.
I think that's going to work itself out, because if I can't get to a container and the availability is not there anyway, I shouldn't be charged for it. And I think the peers are starting to get wise to that now that they've gotten smacked left and right by FMC about it. Not calling any peers out, any specific peers out, but I think all of them have been guilty of that. But we did transload last year, and the transload cost came in at well over 10% of our overall international budget for last year. Well over 10% just to transload containers. And it was just a shock. We knew it was going to be more expensive. We didn't know it was going to be that much more expensive. But we have better flexibility, and we will return product faster. And the domestic rail runs like clockwork. I mean, it really does. It's not like international where we're going to sit and wait till we build a train. It's got to go, because you have U.S. mail on there plus a couple other big contracts that if they don't move, those penalties are difficult for the rail to eat. So, if you're seriously looking at overhauling and you can afford to do it, transloading is not a bad option.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, I think that's a great input to think about it, not only from just a port selection standpoint, but there might be different ways to move cargo. And I think another thing you were talking about with truckers, I think that's such a tough one because there's been so much regulation over the years, which has consumed truck capacity. You don't see a lot of people gravitating towards that particular industry. And when you have these things which slow it down, whether it's regulation or port congestion, it's just makes trucking harder to find because it's just not a growing industry. And, I'm not sure that we're going to have an answer here on this podcast, but it would be interesting to maybe propose solutions when we talk about the future. But before we get there, what I wanted to talk about a little bit is just, you'd mentioned carriers feel similar. And if I'm putting words in your mouth, please tell me. But it felt like, there's 8 major carriers. Maybe they're not differentiating themselves. And when it comes to your contracting process, I think it'd be interesting for our carrier listeners to hear from your perspective, what are those differentiators for you? What's important to you when you're thinking about procuring ocean freight? What creates value for you from an ocean carrier?
Well, I mean, I'd be stupid if I didn't say the first thing was price, right? If the money's not there, forget how other great your service is. I can't afford you, right? So, ocean carriers, if you want my business, come in and offer me $1 for a 40-foot and we'll talk. But that being said, what I look for, do you have consistent sailings out of the ports that I'm going out of? And how many different strings are coming out of that port, right? So if you're coming out of a Shanghai, do you only have 2 strings available? Do you have 4 strings available? Do you have 5 strings available? And are those weekly? Are they biweekly? Are they semi-weekly? How often are you actually shipping out of certain major ports, right? Because if you have multiple strings moving, that gives me options, okay? I can't make it on the boat to LA, but I can make it on the boat to Oakland. Or I can't make it to Seattle to come inland, but I can make it to Vancouver. I can make it to Prince Rupert, or I can go to LA. Those options are huge for us. And let's be honest, 99.9% of the time, ocean carriers are going to commemorate the entire West Coast. I mean, it's not like the East Coast where you've got, reduced rates for the top 3 points, and then you've got add-on rates for certain other areas. It's typically a common rate up and down the coast from port to port. The next thing I look for is, how's your customer service? Am I just going to be a number that calls into a phone line and then I have to sit there for 5, 6 years to talk to somebody?
Right.
Or is it going to be you call in and you have either a dedicated rep or you have a dedicated team that you can go directly to and talk to? And that makes a big difference. My time wasted is your money wasted, is the way that I look at it. And that being said, we have a contract with an ocean carrier, I'm not going to say which one, where my volume is pretty close to nothing with them. But I can pick up the phone, I dial the 800 number, I hit 2 buttons, and within 5 minutes, I'm talking to somebody. That's huge. That is a huge deal for somebody to be able to call in and talk to somebody within 5 minutes on a general 800 number account. That's great. There's another ocean carrier I deal with where I'm on hold for, 25, 35, 40 minutes waiting to talk to somebody. My time lost is your money lost because I'm going to go someplace else if I can. And then billing accuracy. I mean, I don't want to have to re-audit my invoices every 5 minutes. Invoice me what you say you're going to invoice me. And I will say this, most of the carriers do a really, really good job at that. Where I tend to see problems with that is MVOs. And that's not a dig on MVOs. MVOs are wonderful. They're great. I worked for an MVO. I understand that life more than most people do. But consistent billing practices is key. And then, the last thing I would say is technology. I mean, and that's not putting them in a rank order. That's just these coming out. If I go to your website, will you be able to tell me where my container is? I don't need to know in which hold and in which position it is on the boat, but I do need to know, hey, it's on the rail, it's passing Fargo, North Dakota, right? Or it's just got into Chicago. And at least I know where it is. If I know where my cargo is, I can tell my planners where the cargo is. If the planners know where the cargo is, they feel much, much better than, I don't know, it's somewhere between Seattle and here,
Yeah.
or somewhere between LA and here. That doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, usually when you just know where the container isn't, it doesn't help anybody. Well, it's not here, but it could be somewhere
There's a
across.
lot of places that are not here.
Yeah, exactly. It's somewhere on Earth. Let's narrow it down.
Okay, well,
But I want to talk about this for a second because you mentioned a few things. You mentioned, obviously price is important, customer service, the number of services, billing accuracy, technology. So, and I have to ask this question because I worked for carriers for a long time. And one of the things carriers have tried to do is they tried to say, okay, if I do one of these things well, if I do, well, not just one, but let's say I do great customer service and, I have a variety of services. My billing accuracy is incredible. I have this great technology, so easy to use my website. Would you pay more for my service? Can I differentiate myself and charge a higher price because I do this better than anybody in the industry? What's your reaction to carriers trying to do that?
So here's on the service provider and the carrier side of this is the multi-billion-dollar question. Quite honestly, when I was at Hellman, we would lose business. This is not the current regime at Hellman. This was previous regimes. But we would lose business because we weren't the lowest price. And I said, well, we're not the lowest price because you're paying for quality. Okay, well, what is your cost of quality? It's hard to turn around and come up with what is that cost of quality. How much are you investing in to show that we are giving this quality, and that translates into a price advantage of you of X amount. I actually got to the point where I had a director at Hellman tell me if I wanted to work on that for a PhD dissertation, I would probably win some kind of Nobel Prize, because it's the billion-dollar question we've been asking ourselves for at least the last 10 to 15 years is, what is my cost of quality? And I would say, can you do that? Absolutely. And I will tell you right now, the carrier that I'm using right now is not the cheapest carrier, but they're the most consistent. They're consistent. They've got good customer service. We can get a hold of people we need to. We can discuss with top level people when we need to what's going on, where things are. Does it take a little bit of time for the ball to get rolling on certain things? Sure. But, these are multi-billion-dollar companies. I don't expect them to turn on a dime. But that is kind of, from my vantage point in looking at this, is if you're going to bring quality to the table, which is great, and you should, be ready to identify what is your cost of quality.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's great. And I think that's actually good to hear, because I think, again, I've been on both sides of this where, carrier initiative was, hey, we're going to try and improve all these other things, whether it's, number of services or customer service and things like that. We'd have all these KPIs, which would tell us we're doing terrific. But, it didn't feel like it was making an impact, because it was like, God, it feels like the conversation's always about price. What about these other things? And I think it's good to have these kinds of conversations with carriers and remind them that, hey, this is important to me too. I'm not going to be on this race to the bottom. I actually value these things, because it helps bring the industry forward. I think the industry needs to invest in things like customer service and technology. And traditionally, carriers haven't done that as much. I mean, now they have a great balance sheet, so they're like, what can I do with my money? I think it makes sense to invest in these things. And if it can create a better product and help provide a better result in terms of, okay, people are willing to pay more, it's a differentiator, I think that's really good news for ocean carriers.
I think ocean carriers in general have to figure out where they are, right? They're either a white glove service or a no glove service, or there's something in between. And if you're something in between, awesome, you have to be able to sell that. Okay? You have to be able to say, these are my key advantages. It costs me this amount of money to provide these key advantages to you. And that's why our price is X amount more than Joe Blow over here, who's got the lowest base rate in the world, right? And you could go into programs such as NYSHEX, where you could say, hey, we are going to bring a guarantee to the table by signing an NYSHEX contract with you to guarantee that these things that you hold most dear are confirmed. Container availability, getting on the vessel, monitoring KPIs that are technical tier standards. And that's not the sales bit for NYSHEX, but I don't mind singing your guys' praises when you're doing well, and this is something that's very strong within NYSHEX.
Yeah, and I do think, because I wanted to dive into like the technology piece next, because that's one, I mean, that's a space we're operating in. And I think what's interesting for us is that we found that we can help carriers with their technology, deliver better technology. I think carriers are more open to having third parties be involved in their technology delivery process because we can help them move faster. It's hard to get IT resources. It's hard to build things. And when you have somebody who's focused on these things, it's great. But from your perspective, when you look at across the carriers and you look at technology, how has that evolved for you? Or has it not evolved much for you in terms of what they can deliver?
It's not changed where I'd like it to. Let me put it that way. 20 years ago, when I started out with Hellman, almost 20 years ago, when I started out with Hellman, we were doing ASNs, right? We were sending the 856 data so everybody could see the 856 data. And then we started to get the 315 data of, onboard confirmation, vessel departure, vessel arrival, rail departure, rail arrival. Cool. Awesome. We haven't really progressed from a track and trace point or even a top-down feasibility point where that's solid, right? I am utilizing my lead logistics provider. They do our booking and our agency stuff, and they do all the overseas end of it on their side with our oversight, obviously. But we're utilizing them and their technology to gather all this data. And then on top of that, I'm paying them additional to be able to go out and validate the data that the carriers are telling us is actually what the carriers are telling us, and that it's genuine data. And that if there's a hole missing, they actually have, part of the service that I pay for, a coordinator going in and physically filling in that data. That is ridiculous. In an age where we live in, if I went to a carrier and said, where is this container position in this pier? They could literally give you a 3D map. I know because I've seen them, a 3D map of where exactly that container is in the pier at any given time. What flat car is in it? It's on this flat car. It is transiting through this location at this time. Great. Communicate that.
Yeah.
There's no reason why you can't communicate that.
Yeah.
They take in a lot of data and a lot of information, and they may give you the big picture, but then you don't see the real-time statistics. If I was able to get a carrier to send me the real-time data in a batched format once a day, here's where all your stuff is, and it's accurate, I wouldn't have to pay somebody else to do that.
Yeah.
That's a cost to quality thing right there.
I do think it's amazing that I can order something from Amazon and I can say like, hey, your Amazon package is 5 stops away. And then you have these containers which are coming across the globe and you're like, I don't even know where it is. It's maybe buried in the stack. And so I think there's a pretty big gap. I'm encouraged because there's carriers like Hapag-Lloyd that announced like, we're going to GPS track all our containers. I think that's a good step. I don't know how that works when you lease containers too, because you're obviously going to have other containers in there. So what's your visibility there? But I think it's a step in the right direction. I think the technology exists now, and hopefully there's investment here so we can get away from these milestones that are just missing. It happens all the time that there's vendors who can't get it.
I don't necessarily think you need to GPS track a can as much as you just need to link the data together, right?
Yeah.
The rail knows exactly which container is on which flat car and where that flat car is because they have OCR readers. As the train goes by passing certain areas, they know exactly where those flat cars are, so they know where the container is, and that data should be real-time spinning in a database over to the carrier, and the carrier should be able to, I don't want it real-time. I mean, some people might want it real-time. If you're a huge importer, you might want that real-time. But I want a batch at the end of the day that says, here's the last position of all your containers. And to be able to say, here's where they are. This is when they should have moved. And if they haven't moved, it gets put on a flag list, and then customer service, well, not customer service, but operational services is going in to look out and say what's going on and putting incident codes of what the recommendation is to get it fixed.
Yeah.
It's easy to say I want to manage the exceptions, but when everything's an exception, it's hard to get to that point.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I just think the good news is that we could see technology improvements happening. I hope we're somewhere closer. I mean, I think it's a question of not if, it's when, like how soon are we going to see this change? But I do think there's things afoot which are pointing to the technology and the visibility of where things are should be better. I know we're close to the end of the show here, but I did want to ask you your views on what do you see in the future? Like, and I know it's hard to predict the future. I'm usually wrong 90% of the time when I try and predict things, but if, based on what you know today, what's the outlook for the ocean industry? Do you see that, capacity is more available? Do you see things improving? Because there's a lot of things happening. Carriers are deploying more capacity. There's this IMO regulation coming up at the end of the year. There's different things happening, but what's your outlook and how do you see it in the market?
I think 10 plus years will be fine. It's getting to that 10-year mark. So if you want me to go through my pontifery of what I think should change to get to the future we need to be at, we need to have more inland piers. And what I mean by an inland pier is if we look at, for example, Los Angeles, Long Beach, about 60% of the cargo on those vessels is bound for SoCal area general. End of story. Of that 60%, about 80% of that is going into the Inland Empire. So why would we want to keep all of that cargo in an area where we can't expand the pier, we can't expand anything else out, we can't build up anymore because we have wind concerns, and on top of that, Long Beach Port Authority gets really, it's not Long Beach Port Authority, but Long Beach City Council gets weird about stacking heights. And I've been proposing this for years, and it looks like that's going to finally maybe happen. Why don't we take all of the stuff that is going to be SoCal origin termination, use all that lovely on-dock rail that we have, and move it to a rail yard in the Inland Empire? Comes off the boat, it immediately gets put into a stack to go to the Inland Empire, and then you can pick it up. Is it going to add 2, maybe 3 days to everybody's cargo? Yes. But you will save the 3 to 5 days that you have waiting to get an appointment at that pier, because once it gets to that yard, it's a faster turn time. And you can run a yard 24/7 that way, which saves everybody money. All my stuff that goes into SoCal, I have an operation up in Ontario. We've looked at this mathematically from our side. I'm spending over $850 now. No, truckers, please don't call me asking for business. I spend over $850 now going from the Port of Long Beach up to Ontario for a round trip. Whereas if the container was available somewhere in the Inland Empire, I'd probably pay $250, $300. So when I've talked about this with BNSF and UP, and they've said, well, would you be willing to pay $300 to $500 a container to do it? Absolutely, I'd save money. Yeah. There's no reason not to do this. In addition, environmental concerns right there. How much are you wasting money on trucks just sitting idle when you can run an efficient train? I remember the ads back 10 years ago when CSX said, hey, we're the greenest company out there because we move 2 miles of freight on one train. So why wouldn't you want to do this? I see this happening in LA. I see this happening in Seattle. I see this happening in Oakland. Why? Because those piers can't go anywhere. Seattle's on a flippin' island. Seattle is literally an island. They can't go anywhere. So you have to have inland pier points that is going to relieve that congestion. I think we have to get smarter about how we handle rail from an intermodal standpoint. I would love, please don't call me or text me on this, but this has been one thing I've ranted about. I would love to nationalize the railroad. Now, when I say nationalized, everybody calm down. I'm not talking about nationalizing the train companies themselves. I'm talking about the tracks. Just like we have an interstate highway with tracks, we should have national rail tracks. And then what happens? Guess what? All these companies from CSX to Norfolk Southern to UP to BN, hey, even Kansas City can jump in for all I care. I don't care. They can compete on bidding for slots on those tracks, just like we have airports that have airlines that come in. They have to bid for times when their planes can come in. They let the rail carriers bid for the track time. And if they don't move the train, hey, they lost their money. So guess what? That means we're going to actually see trains move quicker because they're going to want to not lose money. Trucks, man, I hope we're getting closer and closer to automated trucking. I really do. I would love for us to get to a point where we can take a bunch of these long haul over the road drivers who are wonderful people and sacrifice their lives to do long haul over the road and move them to local delivery points where we have more local drivers to be able to go out and do the local drive and automated trucks to do the long haul. To me, that would be great. From an ocean side, hey, I'm all ready for the ocean carriers to start having automated vessels. Bravo to one for getting started on this route and having the first automated boats out there to be able to go up and down the coast of China. Great. I'm now ready for you to come to the US. And I'm going to say this because I'd be remiss if I didn't from my tech news people. Elon Musk, where the heck are you? You promised us Hyperloop. I want Hyperloop. I want to be able to have my container go from LA to Chicago in 3 hours, not 6 days. There's no reason why you shouldn't be doing that because it's sure as heck going to be a lot less liability of shipping cargo than it is passengers. So let's make that happen.
Yeah.
And if we can get a Hyperloop to go from China up across Alaska and down to the US West Coast, all the better.
Well, I think those are some pretty interesting ideas. I will say on the infrastructure piece, there, has been talk about improving the U.S. infrastructure, and there's some money appropriated for that. Doesn't feel like that's going to be an imminent solution, but there's definitely a need to address some of those points, particularly with the ports, and you look at how they operate. I cringe when I think, wow, we're putting bigger ships into these trades, huh? Where's it going to go?
In addition to that, when it comes to my predictions, I'm terrible at this too. I said when Hanjin was going down that Amazon was going to come in, jump in, and buy it because Amazon could easily take their MVO status and sell the extra space for 1 to 2% over their cost and make tons of money. And all they're doing is buying the boats so they can move their product. But hey, if we got extra space, we sell it at cost, make tons of money. It's a great, great thing. So I totally think that that's would have been a great idea. But, Jeff didn't listen to me. So,
well, and he started focusing on AWS, and he seems to be doing pretty well with that.
That little web thing. I mean, it's only running 90% of all the internet traffic. I don't see why it's a big deal.
Yeah, right. Well, listen, James, it's been great having you on the show. We're at the point of the show where we allow our guests to play podcaster. You, as a fellow podcaster, this may not be as big of a deal, but for some of our guests, they're excited because I peppered you with questions for some time now. Now it's your chance to turn the tables. Is there anything you'd like to ask or know from the host of Supply Chain Secrets?
What do you think over the next 2 years, because the Biden administration has 2 years left. I'm not saying that they're out in 2024. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they have 2 years left of this term. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. What could the Biden administration do today to make our supply chain more robust and stronger and flexible at the same time?
Wow, that is really a tough question. Because
I'm sorry, did you want me to throw you a softball? Because
no.
I only have baseballs here. I apologize.
No, I like the question, and I'll give you my unvarnished answer because, again, disclaimer, terrible at predictions, okay? But I would say that the Biden administration is going to have to move pretty quickly because I think the signs point to that Congress may not be a Democratic majority after the midterm elections. Now, again, maybe I'm wrong, probably am, but my supposition is that if that changes, that's a completely different landscape for him to work in. And it's probably going to be harder for him to get his agenda across. I think, unfortunately, the time for him to be successful was in the first 2 years of administration because he had the benefit, again, a very slim majority, but it was a majority nonetheless. And I think it's going to be very difficult for him to get things done. And unfortunately, I think you're going to see a lot more stalemate over the next 2 years. Now, if he's very actively involved in this labor negotiation, and I think this is a very concerning thing because he really can't afford for there to be a strike, because if there's a strike, that means there's going to be delayed inventory. It means costs may go up, and that would be...
Forget the inflationary pressure.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, he's not in an environment where he can really allow that to happen. So, I mean, I would like to see the investment. I would like to see both parties come together and agree on some things as far as investing in infrastructure, as far as trying to fix some of the trucking problems we have and create incentives around trucking in the US, because you don't see people gravitating towards that, and it's increasingly an issue. And I think the biggest problem I see today is that the pressure to get space from Asia into the US is reducing. But if you're trying to move a cargo inland or you're trying to find a trucker, that's still a problem. And these are infrastructure type issues. And so I think if there could be some focus there, and I could ask both sides of the aisle, listen, the companies in the US really need this. I would love to see them come together and make some investment either on the trucking or infrastructure side. Or I like some of your ideas on the railroad, but something needs to be done because it's a constant pain point, and it just creates a lot of cost for businesses, which results in cost for the consumer. And I think there's a way to make it more efficient.
I think the only difference that I would say with what you said, or the only point I would take, is I actually think, and this is not predictions, because again, I'm not going to get into that game of political predictions, but if the Democrats lose and you do have a Republican Congress and a Democrat White House, I actually think it's going to move things faster, because a lot of what's been going on in the Democrat Party has been split because they've had so many things they've wanted to do and so many different ideas and concepts that they haven't been able to galvanize and focus together. And I think Biden, being the deal maker that he was in Congress before he became a VP and before he became president, I think the deal maker could come through and bring both sides together on a few core things to get things moving. But hey, maybe I'm just smelling daisies.
Yeah, but James, I love that. And I hope you're right, because then that means we can work together in a two-party system and actually get things done, because it does feel like there's been a lot of stalemate over the past few years, and we just need to make more progress faster. So, and that's not me leaning one way or the other. That's me saying, like, I'd like to see more progress from our government, but I'll say that for another podcast. But James, it's been great having you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was a great show. Had a lot of fun. And for our listeners, don't forget, give us feedback wherever you listen to our podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever you find us. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.